You think you know Marooned? Think again. Months before Apollo 13, Jim Lovell's wife watched this film and had nightmares that became real when her husband's mission failed. NASA's head of public affairs tried to kill the production, fearing it would terrify the public.
Hey, looks like a fine day down there.
And the Soviet rescue ending predicted Apollo-Soyuz 6 years before it happened. Today, we're exposing 14 hidden truths behind Marooned, including the haunted Apollo 1 capsule used for sets, Gene Hackman's only sci-fi role that he hated, and the reason this Oscar-winning film ended up mocked on Mystery Science Theater 3000. 1. The Apollo 13 Nightmare. This one is genuinely unsettling. Months before the real Apollo 13 mission launched in April 1970, astronaut Jim Lovell took his wife Marilyn to see Marooned in theaters. In the film, an astronaut also named Jim faces a slow, agonizing death trapped inside a crippled Apollo capsule with no way home. The movie traumatized Marilyn Lovell so deeply that she had recurring nightmares about her husband being sucked out of an airlock and dying alone in space. When the real Apollo 13 disaster happened just months later, and Jim Lovell's crew actually became stranded, those nightmares turned into her worst waking fear. Years later, director Ron Howard deliberately recreated one of Marilyn's nightmares as an actual dream sequence in his 1995 film, Apollo 13. A tribute to her experience. It's one of the most eerie examples of fiction foreshadowing reality in film history. A movie about a space disaster that predicted an actual space disaster within months of its release. Sometimes movies don't reflect reality. They warn you about it. 2. The haunted Block 1 capsule. The production of Marooned used a real boilerplate version of the Block 1 Apollo spacecraft for the interior sets, an actual full-scale engineering test article that NASA had built for training purposes. This was the exact same model type involved in the tragic Apollo 1 fire on January 27, 1967, which killed astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee during a ground test. The Block 1 capsule had a notoriously complicated hatch design that couldn't be opened quickly from the inside, a fatal design flaw that contributed to those deaths. Because the production was using an authentic Block Y model, the actors were genuinely claustrophobic and frightened while filming inside the heavy metal shell. They knew they were sitting inside a replica of a coffin that had killed real people. That psychological weight made their performances feel authentically desperate and trapped. Because in a sense, they were. 3. Gene Hackman's only hard sci-fi. Despite having one of the most legendary and diverse careers in Hollywood history, Marooned is the only grounded, scientifically accurate science fiction film Gene Hackman ever made. He reportedly took the role only because he was contractually obligated to Columbia Pictures and needed to fulfill his deal. Hackman found the highly technical nature of the script frustrating and boring. He was an actor who thrived on emotional complexity and character work, not memorizing technobabble about oxygen systems and orbital mechanics. He rarely spoke positively about the experience and never returned to the science fiction genre afterward. He preferred roles rooted in gritty realism like The French Connection and Unforgiven rather than beeps and buttons. For Hackman, Marooned was a job, not a passion project. His discomfort with the material occasionally shows through in his performance. And that's Gene Hackman. Even when he's not invested, he's still better than most actors at their best. 4. The no-music rule director John Sturges made a radical creative choice that was almost unheard of in 1969 Hollywood. There is virtually no musical score in Marooned once the astronauts reach space. Instead of traditional orchestral music to guide the audience's emotions, the soundtrack consists entirely of the mechanical hum of the spacecraft, the repetitive beeping of instruments, and the terrifying, oppressive silence of the vacuum. Sturges wanted the audience to experience the same sensory deprivation and isolation as the stranded crew. Understanding that space is not an adventure, it's a void where you die alone if anything goes wrong. The lack of music makes the film almost unbearably tense and slow, which is exactly what Sturges intended. It alienated mainstream audiences who expected conventional thriller pacing. But it created an authentic sense of dread that few space films have ever matched. Silence is scarier than any soundtrack. 5. Predicting the handshake in space. Marooned ends with a last-minute rescue involving a Soviet Voskhod spacecraft docking with an American Apollo capsule to save the stranded astronauts. In 1969, this was considered pure fantasy. The United States and Soviet Union were locked in the space race, treating each mission as a propaganda battle. The idea of cooperation in orbit seemed impossible, but the film is now credited with planting the seed for the 1975 Apollo-Soyuz test project, where American and Soviet spacecraft actually docked in orbit for the first time as a symbol of détente during the Cold War. The handshake between American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts in 1975 looked almost identical to the scene from Marooned. The film imagined a world where survival mattered more than politics. 6 years later, that world briefly existed. Sometimes fiction doesn't predict the future, it creates it. 6. NASA's internal sabotage. While NASA eventually provided technical cooperation and access to facilities for Marooned, their head of public affairs, Julian Scheer, actively tried to sabotage the production before it started. Scheer wrote an internal memo stating it would be better for the agency if this picture was never made. He feared that showing a spacecraft failure and astronauts dying in orbit would terrify the American public and jeopardize congressional funding for the Apollo program. NASA was trying to sell space exploration as safe, heroic, and inevitable. Marooned directly contradicted that narrative by showing how easily everything could go wrong. Scheer lost the internal battle. NASA grudgingly cooperated, but his concerns proved prescient. The film did scare people, and it made the real Apollo 13 disaster feel even more terrifying when it happened, because audiences had already seen how it could end. 7. The highest-paid director. In Hollywood. To secure John Sturges, the legendary director behind The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape, producer Frank Capra Jr. paid him $750,000. That was the highest fee ever paid to a director in Hollywood history at that point. Sturges was famous for being a meticulous perfectionist and a gadget freak obsessed with technical accuracy. That made him the perfect choice for a film about orbital mechanics and spacecraft systems. He spent months at NASA facilities interviewing engineers, technicians, and astronauts to ensure that every single line of dialogue about oxygen reserves, trajectory calculations, and re-entry procedures was scientifically accurate. Sturges treated Marooned like a documentary rather than a thriller. His obsessive attention to detail is why the film still holds up as one of the most realistic depictions of spaceflight ever made, even if it bored mainstream audiences to tears. 8. The Skylab Prototype. The space station depicted in Marooned wasn't a random Hollywood invention. It was based on early, top-secret NASA mock-ups and conceptual designs for what would eventually become Skylab, America's first space station. Because Skylab hadn't launched yet and was still in the planning stages, the film gave audiences their first-ever glimpse of what living and working in a space laboratory would actually look like. The production designers worked directly with NASA engineers to create a realistic orbital station with rotating modules, docking ports, and cramped living quarters. When Skylab finally launched in 1973, many viewers recognized elements from Marooned in the actual station design. The film wasn't just entertainment, it was an educational preview of the future of space exploration. 9. The Space Travelers. Disaster. Here's how an Oscar winner becomes a punchline. In the 1990s, the distribution rights to Marooned were purchased by a low-budget company that retitled the film Space Travelers. They wanted it to sound like a generic action-adventure movie for late-night television and video rental. This cheap rebranding had an unexpected consequence. Space Travelers became the only Academy Award-winning film for Best Visual Effects ever to be featured, and mercilessly mocked on Mystery Science Theater 3000. The MST3K crew riffed on the film's slow pacing, technical dialogue, and lack of traditional action, turning an Oscar winner into cult comedy fodder. It's a bizarre legacy for a film that was originally taken very seriously as a prestige production, and it shows how easily a movie's reputation can be destroyed by poor marketing and cultural context shifts over time. 10. Real-time tension director John Sturges filmed several key sequences, including the final rescue countdown and docking procedure, in near real time with minimal editing or cutting. He refused to use fast-paced editing techniques or compressed time for audience convenience. He forced viewers to sit through every agonizing second of the NASA procedures. Scenes which could have been condensed to 30 seconds in a conventional thriller instead stretched to 5 or 10 minutes. Watching instruments slowly change, mission control personnel waiting in silence. Modern audiences find this pacing excruciating, but Sturges believed that authentic tension comes from understanding how slowly and methodically space operations actually work. Every second matters when you're running out of oxygen. He wanted the audience to feel every one of those seconds ticking away. 11. The floating wires. Despite winning the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, Marooned's zero-gravity sequences were achieved using fairly primitive techniques by modern standards. The production built a full-size Apollo capsule mock-up and suspended it on complex hydraulic wires and rigging that could simulate the gentle floating and tumbling of objects in microgravity. If you watch closely during Pruitt's final spacewalk sequence, you can occasionally see the thin support wires reflecting the studio lights. Brief glints that break the illusion. The Academy overlooked these imperfections because the scale and ambition of the sets were so massive and unprecedented for 1969. Most audiences watching on theater screens couldn't resolve the fine details where the wires became visible. It's a reminder that even Oscar-winning effects are often held together with literal strings. Movie magic relies on the audience's willingness to ignore the mechanics. 12. The fake hurricane. The film's climax is complicated by a massive hurricane hitting Cape Kennedy in Florida, threatening to delay the rescue mission beyond the point where the astronauts can survive. The hurricane was created using massive aircraft jet engines positioned on the studio backlot. They generated winds powerful enough to simulate a Category 3 storm. The engines blew so hard that they shattered several windows in nearby buildings and caused minor property damage to surrounding neighborhoods. Gregory Peck, playing the stoic NASA flight director, had to perform his critical dialogue scenes while being blasted by genuine 100 miles per hour winds. It was almost impossible to hear or speak. The physical brutality of filming those sequences gave Peck's performance an authentic desperation. He wasn't just acting stressed. He was genuinely being battered by hurricane-force winds and struggling to maintain composure. 13. Natalie Wood, the secret translator. During production, a delegation of Soviet cosmonauts visited the Marooned set as part of a cultural exchange program during a brief thaw in Cold War relations. Problem: none of the American cast or crew spoke Russian. None of the Soviet visitors spoke fluent English. Awkward diplomatic situation. Actress Natalie Wood, who was filming a different movie on an adjacent soundstage at Columbia Pictures, was brought over to act as the official translator. She was fluent in Russian. Her parents were Russian immigrants, and she'd grown up speaking the language at home. Wood spent an afternoon facilitating conversations between Hollywood's fake astronauts and real Soviet space travelers. The film's fictional U.S.-Soviet cooperation became briefly real. It's one of the most charming and bizarre behind-the-scenes stories from the production, and it demonstrates how deeply the space race had penetrated popular culture. 14. The screaming commander. Contemporary critics and real military personnel heavily criticized Marooned for showing astronauts and mission control personnel displaying open emotion and panic during the crisis. Real Air Force pilots who attended a special screening at Norton Air Force Base reportedly laughed out loud at a scene where David Jansen's character has what they called a tantrum in mission control, arguing passionately with superiors about rescue options. The pilots argued that real commanders would remain cold-blooded and emotionally detached regardless of how dire the situation became. Military training specifically eliminates emotional responses during emergencies. Director John Sturges defended his choice. He argued that showing human emotion made the characters relatable and the stakes real for civilian audiences. The criticism stung, but Sturges stood by it. The debate reveals a fundamental tension in how space exploration was portrayed, as superhuman achievement requiring machine-like discipline or as human endeavor full of fear, doubt, and desperation. Sturges chose humanity. The military chose professionalism. Neither was wrong. So would you trust a 1969 computer to bring you home from space, or are you staying safely on Earth? If you want more deep dives into the films that saw the future before it happened, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments if you think Marooned deserves more respect. See you in the next one.